At the twilight of the Roman Republic, few names loom larger or cast deeper shadows than Lucius Cornelius Sulla, born into a once respected but struggling patrician family. Sulla's path from obscurity to unrivaled power is one of the most chaotic, merciless, and impactful sagas in Roman history. His story crosses a landscape of conflict, deception, political intrigue, and personal ambition, all unfolding against the backdrop of a failing republic and the growing tensions that would eventually create an empire. This episode doesn't simply recount Sulla's rapid rise. It dives into the underlying forces that propelled him forward and the foundations of Roman governance he rocked to their roots, from North Africa to Greece, from the Forum to the battlefield. Sulla was influenced by the most unstable moments of his time. Understanding Sulla's journey is essential to seeing how Rome shifted from a senatorial republic to a stage where military strongmen would reign. This isn't just the tale of one man, but of a republic on the edge, its customs tested, its laws altered, and its fate forever reshaped. Welcome to the story of Sulla. Previously, this biography of Sulla was only available exclusively for our YouTube members and patrons. You can join their ranks to unlock more than 200 exclusive videos covering every period of history. All links in the description and pinned comment. Number A. In 138 BC, just 8 years after Carthage's final defeat, the hero of our tale, Sulla, was born in Rome into a branch of the renowned Corneli gens. On the surface, his lineage should have promised a privileged life, but sadly for Sulla, this wasn't true. In contrast to many of the more fortunate Corneli branches, such as that of the Scipios, Sulla's line was relatively poor. At the time, none of his family had risen above the role of praetor for several decades. According to one legend, which has come down to us, Sulla's nurse was carrying her young charge through the alleys of Rome one day when she was stopped by a strange woman. Upon seeing the child, the mysterious figure spoke the words, "Pure tibi iti republici tuae Felix, the boy will be a blessing to you in the state." However, such forecasts seemed far removed from Sulla's reality as he grew into a young adult, and by the time he came of age, his father died, leaving Sulla nothing, and reducing him to living in the same house as a servant. Lacking funds and access to high circles, Sulla, gifted with a crown of golden red hair and blue eyes, found companionship among the drifters of Roman life, actors, something that only worsened his image in the eyes of the elites. It was a twist of sheer fate that shifted Sulla's path. In a brief span of time, both the young man's lover, Nicopolis, and his stepmother passed away, leaving him a generous amount of wealth. Now a man of fortune, Sulla was soon elected quaestor for 107 BC, being appointed to the staff of consul Gaius Marius. Ongoing since 111 BC, the so-called Jugartine War was Rome's desert Vietnam, revealing the absolute worst of Roman corruption and the flaws of its army. Numidian King Jugurtha was evading justice by bribing senators and eliminating foes, while the legions were repeatedly attacked by his guerrilla fighters familiar with the harsh terrain of the Maghreb. To fix this situation, Marius launched an operation into Africa, personally leading the main army, but leaving his subordinate Sulla behind in Italy with the vital job of raising a large cavalry unit. Clearly, the novice quaestor succeeded, and brought a group of horsemen to Marius in the spring of 106 BC. Sulla turned on his infamous charm instantly upon arrival, winning soldiers, officers, and even Marius over. As the war continued, the Romans eventually seized a fort near the river Maluka, where most of Jugurtha's riches were kept, only to hear that Jugurtha had taken Cirta behind them. A DD number 1 marching back, the Romans were met by the Numidian, newly joined by the Mauritanian king Balkis, I of Mauritania. The initial clash with the two kings was an ambush, where Marius and Sulla were pushed into creating a series of defensive rings and enduring the rain of missiles until nightfall ended the confrontation. Unable to push battle into the night, Marius led his troops out early and reached the Numidian encampment at sunrise, defeating them at daybreak. Cautious of more ambushes, Marius and Sulla tracked Jugurtha slowly, with their army arranged in a defensive square. Moving past Setaf and heading toward Cirta, the Second Battle of Cirta started when Jugurtha and Baucis had recovered from their loss, leaving Cirta in a sudden reversal and advancing for massive divisions, reportedly numbering 90,000 troops against Marius' forces. Unsure what Jugurtha intended, Marius paused his army and got ready for combat on the open plains outside the city, assigning Sulla command of the right flank. Jugurtha began the fight, with Baucis and Volax arriving shortly after the start of the skirmish at the Romans' rear, surrounding them. With the Romans pressed from every direction, Jugurtha then lifted his bloodied sword, shouting that he had slain Marius himself. Thrown into panic, the Roman army fell into chaos, except for Sulla, who managed to rupture Baucis and the Mauritanians' line and repel them, opening a path for movement. Marius also regained order in his part of the formation and was able to repel the Jugurthine horsemen on the Roman left, letting him and Sulla launch a counter-encirclement against the Numidians. Suddenly overwhelmed, Jugurtha abandoned the fight, and his army was crushed. This triumph made Jugurtha's allies, especially his father-in-law, Bacchusai of Numidia, falter, so Marius dispatched Sulla to negotiate. The latter quickly worked his way into Baucis' favor, calming and advising him as if he was a trusted advisor, not a rival envoy. Real or staged, this diplomatic bond enabled Sulla to conclude the war. Meeting in the heart of the desert, Baucis assured both Sulla and Jugurtha that he would hand the other over, allowing the Mauritanian king to lean whichever way he preferred. Drawn by Sulla's offer of generous terms, Jugurtha came for talks unarmed, and was instantly captured by men springing from cover. He was chained and delivered to Sulla, who then handed him to Marius, whose envy at the praise earned by his subordinate sparked a rivalry that lasted a lifetime. With the African war finished, the Marian troops were summoned back to Italy to face an invasion of Germanic tribes in the Cimbrian War. Sulla wasted no time in using his famous charisma to split the Germanic Marsi tribe off from their allies, and convince them to side with Rome, a major diplomatic win for the campaign. Knowing Marius's shadow would always dim his progress, Sulla chose to serve Rome's other consul, Catullus, in hopes that military glory of his own would speed up his rise. In 101 BC, Sulla solved a supply crisis among Catullus' men so well that not only was he able to nourish Catullus' forces, but Marius' legions too, sparking Marius' jealousy once more. Thanks to Marius' politically driven deployment, Sulla was pushed into a fairly minor role in the final Roman triumph of the Cimbrian War at Vercellae. After that, Sulla went back to Rome, and his political life began in earnest. 98 BC, however, saw the driven noble fail to win the praetorship, due to basing his campaign on his military service as a junior commander. Sulla took the hint, won next year through bribes and shamelessly saying what voters wanted to hear. As urban praetor, he had a century's supply of exotic lions shipped from his royal ally Baucis for show at the Apollonian Games, gaining massive support, which only worsened Marius' rage. According to ancient accounts, Sulla's term ended abruptly when he was assigned to handle the pirate-ridden province of Cilicia as propraetor. However, the pirate matter soon took second place to the greater conflict brewing in Asia Minor between Rome and the Kingdom of Pontus led by Mithridates VI. Since 114 BC, Mithridates had expanded Pontic control across Anatolia, and in doing so, drew the watchful eye of the Roman Republic. By the time Sulla arrived to begin his term in 96, Mithridates had managed to expel or kill 2 Cappadocian kings. Installed in their place was a son of the Pontic king, and when the Romans ordered that puppet to withdraw, Mithridates appointed a supposedly independent regent named Gordius, who was almost certainly still operating in the king's interest. Almost immediately after the propraetor landed, He was given commands to take his tiny forces and expel the Mithridatic proxy from Cappadocia for good. Despite having inadequate troops for the mission, Sulla took his modest army, bolstered it with allies from the towns of Asia Minor, and set out on campaign. It is one of history's great losses that we have limited records describing what was likely one of Sulla's most impressive military feats. Still, what we do know is that, by combining battlefield prowess and political cunning in the rugged Cappadocian region, the Propraetor expelled Gordius with his patchwork army and restored the once exiled king Ariobarzanes to his throne. In the wake of that success, Sulla was not only hailed as imperator by his troops, but also reached the Euphrates River and accepted the first-ever embassy from the rising Parthian Empire to the rising Roman state. Again, the Propraetor asserted his and his republic's dominance in the typical blunt Roman fashion. He brought 3 chairs to the summit, seating himself in the center, while both the Cappadocian and Parthian delegates were pushed to the left and right. This meeting was ultimately productive for Sulla in a diplomatic way, resulting in a treaty of friendship between the 2 major powers, but it also reinforced Rome's symbolic dominance. Rome sat at the center of events, managing the insignificant Parthians as easily as it controlled the puppet of Cappadocia. When the Parthian monarch heard of the insult, his envoy was executed for permitting it. Nothing further of note occurred for the rest of Sulla's term as governor. And even the length of time itself isn't known for certain. But by 93 BC, his posting was over, and he was heading back to Rome. Now his journey as a great figure could begin in full. Just as the rising star was about to take the next step in his path, however, the tribune, Livius Drusus, originally backed by Sulla due to his hope for a powerful senate, was murdered in 91 for supporting citizenship for Rome's Italian allies. With that killing, the Republic collapsed into a self-inflicted civil war of terrible size, the Social War, and the rising Sulla was summoned to serve in the bloody conflict alongside his hardline political enemies, such as the Populares' favorite, Marius. As Romans and their former comrades at arms battled and killed each other on 2 separate fronts, Sulla steadily became a hero. A DD number 2 at the start of the war, Sulla was chosen as a legate under Marius himself, the 2 cooperating despite their supposed hostility. In 91 BCE, Sulla and Marius were attacked by the Marsi and Marrucini after they had delivered a series of losses against the Romans, but Marius and his student managed to repel them, chasing them into a vineyard. The cornered Marsi engaged Marius but were beaten back and forced to flee over the walls of the vineyard, where they suffered heavy casualties. Having expected their escape, Sulla outflanked them and intercepted the escaping Marsi on the far side of the walled vineyard, killing 6,000 and seizing a large cache of arms and armor. This marked the first Roman win of the war, right at the end of the campaigning season, delivering a badly needed lift to Roman morale on Sulla's part. After the clash, Marius sent Sulla to rescue the surrounded city of Isernia, but he would not arrive in time to stop the Samnite forces besieging the city in 90 BCE at the start of that year. They had already crushed a Roman force under the consul L. Julius Caesar, and the Samnites under Duilius had predicted his arrival in one of the tight passes approaching the city. Sulla's 24-cohort-strong force was ambushed by the Samnites as he passed through the ravine, and appealed to Duilius for a pause to discuss terms. The Samnites, thinking they had the advantage, relaxed their defenses overnight as they planned to parley with Sulla, a scenario in which he quickly stepped up to the moment, using the cover of night to conceal his army. He ordered the Cornicans to keep sounding the watches in the Roman camp, leaving it standing but marching his troops, their gear, and the artillery out and around Duilius' force until the 4th watch, when the small crew of trumpeters rushed after him. Duilius' men were left confused and stunned. Although the records get unclear after this, did Sulla lift the siege of Isernia and crush Duilius, or was he forced to retreat? Sadly, we might never know. However, Sulla's distinguishing himself in the early years of the struggle lifted him to new heights, ultimately leading to his promotion as proconsul after the death of Cato in 89 BCE and being handed command of an army for the campaign against the Samnites. Unlike his forerunner Caesar, Sulla swiftly secured a string of victories in Campania against the Italic insurgents, retaking Stabia and beginning the siege of Pompeii. Evidently, the siege wore down the troops, who grew weary of the arrogance of the legate and former consul, Postumius Albinus, stoning him to death. Sulla responded quickly to calm the crisis, opposing the views of some commanders who wished to have the rebels harshly punished. Sulla understood the importance of keeping unity during the war, and especially the siege at Pompeii. Instead of acting harshly, Sulla took advantage of the natural remorse felt by the soldiers, simply reminding them that he expected compensation in the form of greater bravery and grit during their upcoming battles. ADD number 3, the soldiers would soon get their chance, as the Samnite army under L. Cluentius advanced via nearby Nola and set camp less than a half-mile from Sulla, provoking him into a reckless first strike. Sulla was swiftly repelled, but waited for his foraging units to return, and then launched a second strike on Cluentius, which succeeded and made him shift his camp. Cluentius then waited for his own backups in the form of a massive group of Gallic defectors, formerly in Roman ranks. The two sides lined up their armies for a traditional battle, and as they approached within a few hundred meters of each other, supposedly a massive Gaul emerged from Cluentius' side, daring any of the Romans to face him in single combat. The challenge was then taken and accepted by a Mauritanian man of small size, who killed the Gaul and triggered the entire Gallic unit to flee in panic. This caused the rest of Cluentius' army to collapse and run from the battlefield back to Nola in chaos, with Sulla killing 3,000 in the chase and allegedly another 20,000 at the gates of Nola, including Cluentius himself. After this, Pompeii and Herculaneum rapidly surrendered to Sulla's troops, who then advanced on the territory of the Herpini and their fortress of Eculanum. Eculanum had been one of the instigators and fiercest supporters of the rebel cause, and was therefore punished by Sulla, sacking and burning fire to the town. This display quickly brought about the surrender of nearby towns, and the whole of the Herpini rebels were swiftly brought to heel by Sulla, reversing the devastating defeats of previous years of the war. With flair and skill, the legate then turned and suddenly invaded northern Samnium, leading his troops through the mountains and avoiding an attempted interception by the Samnite general Mutilus. He was able to slip through the passes of the Apennines and surprise Mutilus, ambushing his forces from the far side, scattering them and driving the injured Mutilus to his rapid capture of Bovianum and the Samnite council was a major blow in ending the conflict, and his fast military victories had pulled Sulla out of Marius' shadow. Unlike his success against the Germans, this list of victories closer to home skyrocketed Sulla to the top of Roman society, still shining with the recently won glory of his victories. The once poor friend of actors put himself forward for the consulship, and won by an overwhelming landslide, swept into office by a thankful and awestruck populace. 88 BC was to be his moment, during which Sulla would carve his name into legacy. He would indeed do just that, but in a way far different from what he expected. The new consul wed his son to the daughter of his colleague and political partner, Quintus Pompeius Rufus. Not happy with just one marriage bond, Sulla himself controversially married a daughter of the ancient and powerful Metelli family. Secure in his friendships, the prime consul could proceed in conducting official business and claiming the year's biggest prize, supreme command in a full-scale war against Mithridates VI. Previously seen as just a minor threat, the cunning king of Pontus had taken advantage of Rome's civil chaos-induced paralysis to expand without resistance. When the weakened Romans sent Monius Aquilius to pressure Mithridates into surrender, he was instead defeated, captured, and executed by having molten gold poured down his throat. By the time Sulla assumed his consulship, this upcoming Eastern command and its guaranteed promise of dignitas aplenty was the talk of the town. Motivated by this hunger for wealth and fame, the Republic's elites would tear each other in Rome apart to grab it, especially Sulla and his former mentor, the aging Gaius Marius, endlessly jealous of the rising sun that was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the fading son of Marius, found shared purpose with a radical tribune of 88 BC, known as Sulpicius. Once a Sullan ally, Sulpicius had found the consul reluctant to enact his proposals, and so turned to Marius, in hopes of using the man's great reputation as a weapon. In return for Marius' help, though, the aging general demanded Sulpicius use his influence as tribune to transfer the Mithridatic command, and all its attached honors, to him. When Sulla, still unaware of the plan to deny him, responded by calling a suspension of public affairs in order to give himself time to speak with the people, Sulpicius initiated a wave of riots throughout the city, caught off guard by brutal factional violence, which left his co-consul's son slain on the streets of Rome. Sulla was forced to flee to his loyal army, who were in the process of stamping out the social war's final sparks. Taking advantage of Sulla's absence, Sulpicius went on a legislative spree, passing a number of laws which included fully enfranchising the Italian allies. Then, riding high with success, the tribune seized the Mithridatic command away from Sulla and handed it to Marius. When Sulla discovered this betrayal, he was utterly enraged, realizing he had been boxed into a corner and faced with disgrace and political ruin. So Sulla did the unthinkable. He fired up his rank-and-file legionaries with outrage at the Marians' actions, suggesting that the old general would rob them of the chance for Pontic riches. The troops were so fiercely loyal to their charismatic leader that when Marius sent officers to confiscate the army, they were immediately stoned to death. However, once they realized that Sulla was planning an unprecedented march on Rome, most of his officers defected. Nevertheless, the consul was bold and desperate, and so pushed on with his daring move on the lightly defended capital with 6 full legions. When terrified senatorial messengers came to ask the general why he was advancing on his own city, Sulla simply replied that he planned to liberate it from tyrants. To his view at least, the consul did exactly that. When the army finally arrived, it fought a brutal urban fight against a hastily Marian force. This move was totally unexpected, and Rome had almost nothing to protect itself with. Sulla's idea was to send Pompeius Rufus to crack the Colline Gate in the north, and 2 more legions to storm the Calamontana Gate and Pons Sublicius Gate. On the southeast and southwest ends of the city, in a 3-pronged attack, Sulla himself would enter through the Esquiline Gate, all his troops converging in the middle of the city. Sulla's group, led by Lucius Basilius and Caius Mummius, quickly took the gatehouse and the walls, and his soldiers advanced into the city behind them. Marius had arranged for a fierce defense by the city's people, who hurled terracotta roof tiles, stones, and other hefty projectiles at the legionnaires below. The legionaries were pinned up against the walls of shops and apartment blocks, unable to advance, when Sulla and his men arrived and retaliated by setting the houses ablaze. They pushed up the streets to the Esquiline Hill, where Sulpicius' personal guard was waiting. There, the soldiers clashed in an uphill brawl, and Sulla's men were faltering. Sensing the urgency of the moment, Sulla grabbed the Aquila and pushed forward to the front line, and scolded them if they dared abandon their standards, rallying the men to stand their ground. He then ordered a backup legion to pass through the Viminalis Gate and capture the Suburra near the city center, outmaneuvering Sulpicius' defenses. Desperate, Marius and Sulpicius withdrew back to the Temple of Tellus on the Appian Hill, begging the slaves of the city to take up arms in return for freedom. However, the locals and the enslaved were already abandoning the defense, and with no better options, Marius and his allies fled the city. Marius, for his part, managed to slip from the grasp of his rival, and went into exile all the way to Africa. Sulpicius, however, wasn't so fortunate. Betrayed by a slave and uncovered by sullen forces in a villa near Rome, the tribune was executed, his head delivered to the consul, and all his laws overturned. However, as though to show Sulla's conservative and balanced character, the consul granted freedom to the slave as a reward, and then had him hurled from the Tarpeian rock for betraying his owner. The order had to be preserved, after all. Having secured the capital with his legionary troops, Sulla attempted to fix what he believed to be the Republic's grave issue, the tribunes, who he saw as running wild. To that end, laws that favored the Senate were enacted which restored to that venerable body's sole authority to pass new laws, while the strength of the people's tribune was curbed. As Appian phrased it, voting would be steered by the rich and wise, not the poor and reckless. With the issue apparently resolved, Sulla sent his troops back to Nola and didn't meddle with the next year's elections. But his brash strike on Rome had damaged the consul's reputation so badly that a Marian-leaning politician, Cinna, became consul at the start of 87, soon after Sulla left Rome as proconsul and departed for the east, successful in his ultimate aim to win the command. Since the Pontic king's gilded execution of Manius Achilles and Rome's ongoing distraction with its internal civil strife, the Mithridates situation had blazed from an ember into a wildfire. Almost all of Asia Minor and its wealthy Greek cities were in service to him, and the massacre of perhaps 80,000 Romans and Italians in the area had only bound the locals even more tightly to his anti-Roman agenda. By the time Sulla landed at Dyrrhachium with 5 hardened legions in 87 BC, Pontic-backed Thracian tribes were creating problems for Roman forces in Macedonia. Meanwhile, Mithridates' top general, Archelaus, was heavily entrenched in the Athenian harbor at Piraeus, while a third Pontic force was preparing to swing through Thrace and descend on the Romans from above. Perhaps because his rising political rivals in Rome were choking off his financial lifeline, Sulla began a push on Athens first. Not only would capturing this most symbolically crucial city eliminate a major Pontic foothold in Greece and shower the general with dignitas, but the spoils upon its fall might act as pay, which would help keep his veteran soldiers loyal for the foreseeable future. Sulla was so assured on arrival that he only left a section of his army to surround Athens proper, cut off from the sea as it was, while he himself launched an aggressive assault on the 50-foot-high stone defenses of Piraeus. Contrary to belief, however, the Pontic defenders held their ground impressively, inflicting heavy casualties, despite losing many in return. After a brutal and ultimately failed first attempt, Sulla's troops were beaten back and retreated to Eleusis. The general's pride was wounded badly enough by this early defeat, and salt was rubbed into the injury when the Mithridatic supporting tyrant Ariston and all his Athenians began openly mocking Sulla's sun-spotted complexion by chanting syllabub, syllabub, mulberry crumble, with these constant taunts fueling his resolve. Sulla began chopping down Athens' famed philosophers' groves and using the timber to build serious siege weapons. Additional machines, like catapults and massive towers, were procured from a newly cooperative Thebes, and the demoralized soldiers of the earlier assault were ordered to tear down the 400-year-old long walls and use the rubble to build siege ramps. According to Frontinus, Sulla gave them this dull assignment so that by the time another assault was launched, the men were positively eager to carry it out, if only to escape the soul-crushing monotony. Archelaus received fresh support from his garrisons at Chalcis and on other previously seized islands, then again in the form of a force dispatched by Mithridates himself. Still, constant betrayal by slaves in Piraeus repeatedly enabled Sulla to ambush Archelaus' Sally units and resupply caravans heading to Athens, a once thriving city which was succumbing to starvation with alarming speed, eventually beginning to suspect that traitors were alerting the Romans to his movements. Archelaus countered Sulla with a clever sleight of hand. That night, he sent another caravan of resources towards Athens, which was easily predicted, ambushed, and wrecked. However, that loss also allowed the Pontic commander to send out troops armed with flaming torches, who burned some of the unprotected Roman siege devices. Skirmishes and hunger within Athens escalated until the citizens began turning against Ariston, for whom Sulla had developed a fierce personal hatred. The tyrant was ultimately forced to dispatch envoys in order to negotiate peace with the Roman general. When they arrived, though, the emissaries immediately began by pontificating about Athens' old glories and spewing rhetoric which Sulla was in no mindset to hear, interrupting Ariston's boastful emissaries in a most uncivilized and utterly savage manner, to the sophisticated Greeks at least. Sulla shouted, "My friends, you can pack your speeches and be gone. Rome did not send me to Athens to study past history. My duty is to subdue rebels." It was not long after that Sulla discovered a way into the city and stormed it, allowing his men to loot and pillage Athens in a massacre that was remembered in folk memory forever. In the wake of Athens' collapse, Archelaus raised anchor and sailed away from Piraeus to rendezvous with other Pontic troops at Thermopylae, allowing Sulla to secure the coastal fortress in spring of 86 BC, free from his months-old siege. The Roman general advanced into Boeotia to push forward his campaign against Pontus, after quickly absorbing the 6,000-strong vanguard of a replacement force sent by his Promarian rival Cinna into his own ranks with barely a hint of resistance. Sulla continued his pursuit of Archelaus' army. The two groups encountered one another north of the historic city of Carinthia. It was a poor situation for the Romans, finding the level terrain unsuitable against such a massive cavalry-heavy force. Sulla declined battle when offered and weaved his way south, outpacing a Pontic unit to occupy the strategic Acropolis of Peripotami. When Archelaus sent another detachment to take Carinthia itself, Sullan forces again beat them to it, forcing the frustrated army to take up a new, fortified location on Mount Thurium. Meanwhile, the massive Pontic army established temporary camps in a valley where Mount Acontium in the northwest and Mount Hedilium in the northeast nearly met. The river Cephisus ran through this gorge, forming the left flank of Archelaus' army and the right flank of Sulla's 30,000, never one to miss an opportunity. When a group of Charonian locals offered to hit the Pontic soldiers on Thurium from behind, Sulla agreed eagerly. The battle began with Sulla's apparent retreat, marching away from Mount Thurium alongside the Cephisus while leaving Gabinius to defend the town of Carinthia and Murena on Mount Thurium. In response, Archelaus stretched his line, detaching a flanking party to strike Murena's troops on Mount Thurium. Sulla performed an about-face and joined with Gabinius' force at Carinthia, extending his own line across the valley. Already by this stage, Archelaus' flanking force was engaging the unstable position of Murena, who then launched his counterattack with the locals. Using their knowledge of the nearby terrain, the Charonian units managed to surprise, surround and obliterate Archelaus' force on Thurium. Worse still, their retreat onto the flatlands below was met by a coordinated cavalry assault from one of Sulla's sub-commanders, resulting in even larger casualties and pure chaos in the Pontic army. Sensing the jugular exposed, Sulla called an advance to begin the battle quickly. Archelaus reacted in kind, but found his vanguard of 90 scythe chariots unable to charge properly due to the overcrowding of friendly troops in their path. Calmly watching the enemy chariots' sluggish arrival, there was no fear in Sulla's steady ranks. Gabinius and his forces, stationed in the center, were able to fall back in time behind stakes they had planted in advance, killing the horses of the leading chariots and halting the rest. At a command, javelineers hurled their missiles and wiped out Archelaus' misused shock troops as a sign of their success and a dig at the defeated. Sulla's legionaries clapped their hands, laughing and yelling as if amused by the display. They craved more of the same, to the despair of their enemies. With his flanks wisely anchored by mountainous terrain on both sides, Sulla closed in on the enemy force. His troops pushed forward from the trenches, fortifying their ground, which disrupted and delayed Archelaus' phalanx. To the burning anger of the free Romans, Archelaus had placed a group of freed slaves in the front line. Knowing their only option was to fight or suffer worse at Roman hands, they fought with fierce resolve. The Romans, enraged by their adversary, also fought brutally, knocking aside the pikes or seizing and tearing them from their opponent's grip. The battle had settled to a relative stalemate in the middle, with Archelaus' main body struggling to advance against both the determined Romans and their blocking defenses, supported by anti-personnel artillery, while the Romans struggled to break up the phalanxes, crashing into their ranks. Now that Archelaus' locked phalanx was functioning as the anvil onto which the Roman legions would, hopefully, be hammered and broken, the Pontic general began unleashing that hammer strike. Using his larger numbers, Archelaus extended his right flank and tried to encircle the Roman line on that side. Hortensius' backup cohorts on that wing moved to outmaneuver the attack, but they were struck by Archelaus' elite cavalry squad, split off from the main force, and forced to take shelter in the Thurium foothills. They slowly became surrounded. Having placed himself on the flank at Hadilium before the fight, Sulla quickly detached spare units from wherever he could and then personally rushed to the aid of his left flank, traversing the full stretch of the battle line to do so. By then, the crushing force of Archelaus' charge had been softened. So, seeing the dust cloud which signaled Sulla's arrival, the Mithridatic commander quietly disengaged and slipped away, galloping toward the side from which his opponent had just come. Now sensing danger on both flanks, Sulla and his reinforcements paused, the commander briefly uncertain about where to go next. With notable resolve, given the seriousness of the situation, Sulla detached 4 cohorts to reinforce the left flank against the attack of Archelaus' commander Taxils, while riding to confront Archelaus himself with the remaining unit. In the meantime, the Pontic general had arrived and balanced the wing, although Roman troops continued to press relentlessly. But when the unstoppable Sulla showed up and engaged with his dominant, morale-lifting presence and one fresh cohort of troops, the elite Roman soldiers shattered Archelaus' left without pause. His troops lost their formation and fled in the direction of their camp near Mount Acontium, or towards the river Cephisus. As this unfolded, and perhaps because of it, the other Pontic flank near Mount Thurium disintegrated before Sulla could dispatch any reinforcements, followed by the center. On both ends, thousands of barbarian warriors, as Plutarch calls them, were cut down as they fled. The Pontic commander, known as Taxils, was seized by the victorious Roman army amid the chaos. But Archelaus, and only about 10,000 men, comprising the shattered remnants of his army, managed to escape to Chalcis. As a mark of his success, Sulla built 2 monuments in the area, the remains of one of which was unearthed in the 1990s, atop Mount Thurium. The battle may have been secured for the Romans, but neither the Republic's war nor Sulla's political battle were over yet. News of the catastrophe King Mithridates had endured at Chaeronea crashed down on Asia Minor like a landslide, and cities bound tightly to Mithridates VI by blood, such as Ephesus, Pergamon, and a handful of others, were suddenly creating the King of Pontus headaches. He addressed such uprisings with brutal efficiency. For instance, when the Tetrarch leadership of Galatia seemed as though its loyalty was fading, Mithridates invited them to a feast and had them all butchered. Although the Pontic monarch was occupied dealing with the unrest in Asia, a formidable knack for logistics allowed him to dispatch a general known as Dorilaus at the head of another army into Greece. Both Appian and Plutarch give us a total force of 80,000 for this renewed invasion force. Given their earlier, questionable estimate of 120,000 for Archelaus' army, however, it is probably more accurate to say that Dorilaus sailed into Chalcis with at most another 40,000. After his retreat from the crushing defeat on the plains near Chaeronea, Archelaus had returned to war on a strategic level. using his overwhelming dominance at sea. The general raided his way up and down the Aegean and Adriatic seas, harassing Roman supply convoys, launching amphibious strikes on enemy coastal bases, and even targeting the transports of Marian consul Lucius Valerius Flaccus as they attempted to cross from Italy. Sulla, meanwhile, was confronting the possibility of a three-front conflict at his expense. Replacement legions led by Flaccus, a lieutenant of Cinna and proxy of Sulla's fiercest enemies in Rome, had landed in Greece and were advancing from the north, while Archelaus and his newly reinforced army sat content in Chalcis. Sulla began marching north into Thessaly, where he would engage Cinna's rogue general, but stopped at Numidia upon receiving news that the Pontics were on the move, with a strengthened army at their back. Dorilaus and some of the other commanders, as of yet unfamiliar with the caliber of the Roman legions, pushed for another pitched confrontation, arguing that the small Roman force had no chance of resisting. There's Archelaus urged restraint, but when Dorilaus hinted that the loss at Chaeronea could only have been betrayal to Mithridates, Archelaus quickly aligned himself. The Pontic armies maneuvering back into Boeotia caught the attention of Sulla, who abandoned his campaign against Flaccus without pause in favor of turning back on Archelaus. If the barbarians were craving another thrashing, they were welcome to receive one. A preliminary clash near Tilphossium went in Sulla's favor, leading Dorilaus to retract his aggression and side with Archelaus. However, when the cavalry Pontic army arrived at a vast plain near Orchomenus, it was Archelaus who, encouraged by the advantageous terrain, decided on a pitched engagement. They set camp in a fortified position and waited until Sulla arrived and did likewise. Another battle was certain. The Sullan army, victorious at Chaeronea the prior year, was arranged in 3 lines of combat, each one broken by gaps which enemy charging units could be funneled through. Now, however, the proconsul acted with greater subtlety. His front-line troops, the Antisignati, began forming up with a denser width than those behind, but with more spacing between them and the rows to their rear. The post-signati. Sulla had stakes hammered into the ground in this extra space as an added barrier, cleverly applying the average legionary's reputation as a half-engineer and builder. Sulla immediately set about countering Archelaus' cavalry edge by digging 10-foot wide trenches along each flank. If finished, these makeshift defenses would render huge sections of the field nearly unreachable to the lethal Pontic cavalry, thereby shielding the sides of Sulla's infantry-focused army, seeing the natural advantage of open space vanishing right before his eyes at the hands of the Republican shovel. Archelaus hastily unleashed his cavalry to strike the unprepared Romans in their thousands. They focused mostly on the trench workers, laboring to secure the Roman wings, but their fast mounted charge spooked Sulla's half-formed troops to the edge of collapse. All of a sudden morale was fragile, and the general nearly lost command. True to form, Sulla rose to the challenge and displayed the magnetic charisma for which he became legendary. As the harried infantry worker units out front began reaching a breaking point, especially on the left, their exceptional commander rushed to support them. Arriving on the field, Sulla jumped from his horse and began forcing his way to the very front with Rome's sacred Aquila standard in hand. By that time, some of his troops were attempting to retreat towards the camp, and it was to them he shouted, "For me, Romans, an honorable death here. But for you, when people ask where you betrayed your commander, remember to tell them, at Orchomenus, Sulla's physical presence and his words of burning shame rallied the broken units to new courage." Additionally, 2 idle cohorts from the right wing came to support their commander, together with most of Sulla's officers, who, fearing for their leader's safety, abandoned their own positions to join the battle. With reinvigorated and seasoned troops alike at his back, Sulla led a foot assault and managed to scatter the Pontic cavalry, perhaps as a reward for this swift recovery, or simply to get them energized for the rigors of further combat. Sulla used a pause in the fighting to serve his legion's breakfast. Grateful, the troops eagerly began preparing entrenchments for a second time that day, only to be rushed once again by cavalry and archers. The Pontic army fought fiercely, but the Romans fought fiercer, counterattacking with vigor. The legionary cohorts closed with their foes so quickly that the archers were unable to deploy their weapons effectively, while the Pontic cavalry simply could not rival the Roman soldiery in a grounded fight. Our charge quickly collapsed and was driven back with heavy losses, including that of his son Diogenes, who, according to Plutarch, fought bravely and fell heroically. The first day ended without triumph for either side. In the morning, Archelaus led his own army out into the space between encampments with cavalry on the flanks, scythed chariots in the front, and the Macedonian-style phalanx behind. Still further behind the locked spear array were the remaining slave soldiers from Campania. Upon the Pontic commander's signal, his scythed chariots dashed straight for the first Roman line of Antisignati. As though dealing with such machines was standard procedure for the veterans by now, Sulla's vanguard troops deftly shifted aside, allowing the racing vehicles to crash straight into the field of stakes behind them. Archelaus' chariot assault was over before it even got a chance to truly commence. Roman javelineers swarmed around the cornered Pontics, putting an end to them swiftly. Sulla's soldiers marched rank upon rank, ready to meet the looming enemy. On the far side of the field, whilst advancing his slower infantry onward, in response, Archelaus unleashed the cavalry to keep Roman focus scattered and their formation brittle, so they would be easy victims for a phalanx marching in relentless lockstep. The Roman commander reacted accordingly. Feeding his small number of cavalry through the arranged gaps, Sulla ordered his inferior contingent of horsemen to clash with the charging hordes of their foe. They did so, suffering brutal casualties on both sides, but achieving the mission of blocking Archelaus' charge before it reached the legions. As they were now stationary once more, the approaching legionaries were able to grab hold of and crush the Pontic cavalry, slicing through whole divisions as others ran in terror. Worse still, this disaster unfolded so swiftly that the phalanx hadn't been able to properly organize, granting the Romans free access on the pike. Luckily for them, however, Archelaus was sobered by earlier disasters and ensured there remained a solid path of retreat. When it became painfully clear that his infantry were in the midst of being decimated, the Pontic leader pulled his entire force back. Several thousand of his infantry were slain, but that was minor when compared to double the amount of cavalry, possibly nearing 10,000. Although a smaller figure is probably more realistic. The shattered remainder of Archelaus' army once again sheltered in the camp, which was then besieged and captured in a determined fight. It was another masterful Roman win, but blemished by the Romans' refusal to take captives and their resulting savage massacre. Sulla had defeated a Pontic field army for the second time in as many years, but Archelaus managed to flee once more. That specific detail didn't matter much, even serving to boost the triumphators standing later. All the same, Rome's foreign threat in the form of Mithridates was properly checked, with the Pontic king now considering peace talks with Sulla. For Sulla, it was nearly time to face the internal problem, but the proconsul couldn't yet turn on Cinna and his cronies, as he had diplomatic matters to resolve in Greece and a hostile Roman army, led by the general Flaccus, to confront. To that end, he wintered in Thessaly and readied his legionaries to do battle with their fellow Romans. While Sulla had been waging war against Mithridates, the political climate back home had been flaring up. Aristocratic Romans opposed to Marius and Cinna had begun escaping the capital in great numbers, arriving at Sulla's war camp as to a harbor of refuge, so much that the proconsul and now de facto optimates leader had a kind of senate of his own in the east. Each of these notable men brought dreadful news from home, tales of oppression and cruelty at the hands of political rivals. Sulla's estates and those of his allies were being torched, their backers and comrades murdered, and the republic reduced to base tyranny. Sulla swore it would end, and that all the guilty would suffer. Meanwhile, before taking on the rebel and traitor Sulla, Flaccus Sinanforce embarked on a reckless winter march through Thrace, in hopes of gaining some morale-boosting wins against Pontus. Flaccus was a politically installed general only, and thus was quite unskilled. Critically, however, he flatly ignored the guidance of his appointed military expert, Gaius Flavius Fimbria. By the time Flaccus' struggling army reached the Hellespont, he was viewed with open hatred by both his soldiers and his deputy. When Fimbria threatened to return to Rome, Flaccus had him removed before departing on some errand. Predictably, Fimbria took over the army and had Flaccus' head chopped off when he came back, before throwing it into the sea. So it was that Fimbria became the main Roman rival Sulla would have to face moving forward. While Flaccus was busy ruining his army and his life, Sulla was engaging in diplomacy with the twice-defeated general Archelaus at Dilium. Mithridates, reflecting on the massive casualties endured by his troops in the field so far, had sent Archelaus to offer a truce, but he wasn't doing so just to yield. The king was fully aware of Sulla's political mess, that the proconsul was essentially just a rogue commander with a strong army, and he tried to use that fact. In the name of an alliance and friendship with Sulla's father, General proposed what was basically a blank check in gold. Ships and mercenaries, so long as the Roman commander took those gifts and returned home, leaving Asia behind, with his usual sharp wit. Sulla replied that it was truly unfortunate that it had taken 2 crushed armies and tens of thousands of dead soldiers before Mithridates had remembered they were friends. The suggestion of betrayal against his own republic seems to have irritated Sulla a bit, judging by his counter-proposal, urging the High Pontic general to think of his own future, and hinting that Mithridates' sins needn't be those of all Pontus. Sulla invited Archelaus to betray his king and seize the crown for himself. Then he could reconcile with Rome as a partner of the Republic. Archelaus was naturally horrified by the idea, and made that clear with a strong reply. Sulla then scolded Archelaus in classic Roman oratory style. If Archelaus, the servant who had fled like a scared child after being soundly beaten in battle twice, would never betray his ruler, how dare he expect that Sulla, a Roman and honored proconsul, would stoop to such treachery? After this round of ritual boasting and dramatic flair, the real negotiations began. Little record remains of the finer points, but we know the final outcome. Archelaus would give up all his ships and leave Greece. Mithridates was to withdraw. From the illegally held regions of Asia Minor, prisoners and defectors would be returned, and, to top it all off, 2,000 talents would be paid as a war fee. Some firm back and forth followed, during which Mithridates initially resisted parts of the deal, but relented when Sulla threatened, basically, to show up and force him. During the entire affair, Sulla took the subtle but extremely smart move of keeping Archelaus nearby, doting on the general, and even caring for him when he got ill. This had the dual effect of stirring quiet accusations of treachery about Archelaus among the Pontic royal circle, slowly weakening the tie between Mithridates and his best general. On the flip side, he was still a useful contact with the king that Sulla could exploit. After a fairly tense personal meeting with Mithridates, Sulla finalized the Peace of Dardanus on the terms he had put forward. According to the outraged Roman troops, though, these mild terms for such a vile enemy of the Republic like Mithridates couldn't be accepted. Charismatic as ever, Sulla flipped the situation back on his enraged men by pointing out that fighting both the Roman force led by his political enemy, Fimbria, while still battling Pontics, would have been an unworkable feat. Sulla was, naturally, just thinking of his men. That Pontus had been well and truly humbled, Sulla bounded through Asia to deal with Fimbria. It was a simple task. After a few days of hard marching, the sullen army caught up with their Roman enemy near the Lydian city of Thyatira. The grizzled Marian commander initially mocked his Roman rival, but upon seeing the hopelessness of the situation, he escaped to Pergamon and committed suicide. For now, The war in Asia with Pontus and fellow Romans was over, and a relative lull descended. Sulla didn't take this as an opportunity to relax, however, instead spending the winter of 85–84, relentlessly gouging the wealthy Asian territories for as much as he could. When that was finished, the victorious general went back to Athens, a city which he had so recently treated with viciousness, and immersed himself in the culture. Although stricken by a bout of illness during his stay, Sulla found time to be inducted into the famous Eleusinian, Mysterious and Pilfer, one of the city's Greek libraries. Taking a short rest across the straits, the general came across a fisherman from Halai, a city he had previously obliterated, who gave him a gift of high-quality fish. When Sulla realized their origin, he is said to have exclaimed in shock, "What? Is any man off Halai still alive?" The fishermen feared for their safety, mistaking his surprise for anger. But Sulla smiled with light-hearted grace, and said that the men were fine representatives of their city. Still, the general had a great number of Romans in his entourage, who were itching to get me and get revenge on the supporters of Marius, who had torched their homes and killed their families. Their eastern adventure couldn't last forever, and a reckoning was at hand. By autumn of 84 BC, Sulla and his thoroughly leveled-up army of veteran killers were en route to one of the main embarkation points for transport across the Adriatic, before the upcoming civil war, however, could even begin. Sulla discovered, rather anticlimactically, that the two primary Marian instigators, Cinna and Marius himself, were already dead. To set the stage for what came next, we must go back in time and outline events that took place in Italy between the time Sulla, disgraced and outpoliticked in the aftermath of his consulship, left to war against Mithridates in 88 BC, and when his triumphant forces finally returned 5 years later, a period sometimes known as the Sign-in Republic. Typically cutthroat latrum and legal maneuvering between Cinna and Sulla's allies started virtually the instant the latter departed, leading eventually to the exile of the former and the ignominious end of his consulship. Taking a page from Sulla's ruthless playbook, Cinna gathered popularis allies to his side, bribing and enticing the army besieging Nola into following him. Buoyed by the support of Marius and luminaries such as the famous Quintus Sertorius, Cinna too marched on Rome in late 87 BC. Unlike Sulla's unprecedented but not overly brutal occupation of Rome not long before, the popularis seizure of Rome in 87 provoked a veritable bloodletting among the Optimate faction. Among the scores of prominent Romans killed in the sorry episode were the wealthy Publius Licinius Crassus and his eldest son, Publius' second son. A certain Marcus Licinius Crassus survived and escaped to the care of clients in Hispania, where he began raising a private army. Marius and Cinna took the consulships for themselves, rescinding Sulla's legislation, confiscating the proconsul's property, and even endangering his family. By the skin of their teeth, Sulla's wife Metella and their children managed to get clear of hostile forces and escape to join him in Greece, together with a host of other displaced Optimates. So it was that an ideological divide was in violence and became a blood feud that could only be repaid in one way. When Sulla did return, it would be as a merciless vindicator. In the aftermath of the Purge of 87, an aging Gaius Marius, far beyond his martial prime, came to realize this terrible fact. Sooner or later, he would have to face Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a fearsome general, at the very apex of his abilities, fresh from conquest. He was a setting sun, and Sulla, the rising sun. Sheer dread at the prospect finally collapsed the old general's resolve. He fell into alcoholism, and only 17 days into his prophesied 7th consulship, died in 86 BC after this. Cinna firmly took the reins of the state and began raising forces, intent on meeting Sulla in Greece, so that Italy might be spared the horrors of a true civil war. Therefore, in 84 BC, Cinna began ferrying legions across the Adriatic, but a storm scattered the second convoy and provoked mutiny among the men already in Illyria. Cinna addressed them and attempted to force discipline, a tactless decision, which led to his shameful death. The new de facto popularis leader was Gnaeus Papirius Carbo, who recalled the troops and decided to fight it out in Italy, with the context of Cinna's republic established. It is high time to detail the distribution of relevant forces who will fight this first proper Roman civil war. The social war had technically been a fight of Romans against allies, while Sulla's first occupation of Rome was barely a conflict at all. But this upcoming clash between two diametrically opposed political factions was very different. Romans of senatorial rank would murder others of their kind in full-scale warfare for the first time. In spring of 83 BC, at Dyrrhachium, the Optimates champion Sulla was ready to make his long-promised return to Italy. With him were 30,000 legionaries of the very highest quality, men with years of experience fighting as a cohesive, deadly force in war. Their pockets were also chock full of loot plundered from the war with Mithridates, prompting peerless loyalty to their beloved commander and vastly increased discipline. They had no need to loot Italy. They were already rich after all. 10,000 additional lower-quality infantry reinforcements had been gathered from the Greek territories controlled by Rome, supplemented by a formidable strike force of 6,000 cavalry. This killer army was the rock-solid core of the Optimates' cause, but was not its only fighting strength. Among Sulla's coalition of the Republic's best elements, as they might call themselves, were influential aristocrats such as Metellus, Pius, son of the consul whom Marius had humiliated and outshone decades earlier, vengeful who had lost his father and brother, was ready to march as well. Armed with his family's wealth and a small army of around 3,000, the primary popularist leaders in 83 BC were Carbo-Sidus, successor to the position of quasi-dictator of Rome, in addition to the two annual consuls, Scipio and Norbanus. Fighting a civil war in Italy gave a propaganda advantage to the populares because, as Appian tells us, the actions of Sulla, who was marching against his country, seemed to be that of an enemy, while that of the consuls, even if they were working for themselves, was ostensibly the cause of the Republic. Even though we know in hindsight that Sulla will decisively win this war, it is important to realize that it was far from an easy fight. Scholars estimate that Cinna manpower potential as being at least around 100,000, even though this potential had yet to be exploited. To begin doing so, both Scipio and Norbanus were in campanially in the consular armies to face Sulla, eager to get the show on the road and likely pressured by many of his aristocratic supporters to do just that. Sulla and his army of conquest from Dyrrhachium in two contingents, one of which landed at Tarentum, while the other, including among it himself, sought harbor at Brindisi, likely a bit nervous at what was about to do. Sulla got a bit of relief when the Brundisians didn't resist his landing, instead welcoming the general. In gratitude, residents of this faithful coastal city were granted exemption from the harbor tax. More than a gesture of simple thankfulness, however, this boon was almost certainly part of a wider propaganda campaign designed to show Italy that if towns and cities supported the Sullan cause, they would be richly rewarded. Whatever the case, 40,000 invading Roman troops were now on home soil. The two divisions linked up shortly after their arrival and began an inexorable march towards Campania, where the enemy armies were massing. Not only did Marcus Licinius Crassus join Sulla en route, but another total wildcard made his Machiavellian opening move in a political and military career that would eventually have him become Rome's most powerful man. Erupting from vast family estates in Picenium, a rising star in his early 20s named Gnaeus Pompey raised a small band of troops, as Cassius Dio called them, from his swath of clients, as well as his father's die-hard veterans, and declared for Sulla. This opportunistic proclamation came after the young man had initially marched with Cinna during his doomed venture. After soundly beating Marian forces under Carbo, who subsequently arrived to stop him. Pompey arrived at Sulla's camp, where he was treated with incredible respect and declared meritor, with these illustrious new friends, and many, many more. Flocking to his banner, Sulla advanced along the Via Appia until the army reached Codium. He then swept by Saticula and Calatia, with a first true strategic objective firmly in sight, Capua. On his way, Sulla was able to forbid and enforce a complete ban on looting the Italian countryside. His cause was to be that of a heroic Roman liberator who meted out harsh justice to the guilty, but retained mercy for the innocent. Moreover, clemency might induce desertion from the enemy's cause, which was of course the prime motivator. Meanwhile, Norbanus and Scipio managed to get hair-greenhorn armies together and march to war themselves. Directed by Carbo, unsure which line of march Sulla would opt for, the consuls divided their formidable forces, with Norbanus taking a slightly larger force to block the Vulturnus crossing on the crossroad between the Via Appia and Latina. Scipio took up a position further north, near the city of Tinum Sedicinum. The war was about to begin in earnest, when Sulla grasped that he was facing two divided armies, rather than a single overwhelming one. The Optimate proconsul beelined down Therode to Capua and straight at Norbanus, whose dedication to the Marian cause was more fervent than that of his consular colleague. His army, whose command structure included Marius' son, was also the more dangerous of the two, being larger and subject to greater discipline. The two armies caught sight of one another when Sulla neared Norbanus' position on the Vulturnus, his spirits made optimistic by the support of so many prominent men of the Republic. Sulla sent emissaries in an attempt to bring the bristly consul over to the Optimate side and to avoid the slaughter of Romans. The proconsul's olive branch was snapped when Norbanus harmed the envoys, and a great battle became inevitable. On the rolling foothills of Mount Tifata, 40,000 Sullan troops met roughly 60,000 Marians and crushed them with contemptuous ease, supposedly not even having to properly get in formation to do so. According to Plutarch, the veterans' enthusiasm and zeal for the melee was so great that they simply swept Norbanus' newly raised army away in a great rush, killing somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 men, whilst apparently only losing 70. Sulla himself commented later that it was this moment that made him believe victory was probable. Until Tifata, Sulla had been secretly nervous that the soldiers might desert him and return to their homes, as was customary for legionaries. All throughout the Republic, victory against Thablicos' consul only fired up the soldiers even further, making them all the more confident in final victory and solidly aligned to their great red-headed general. Although Norbanus managed to retreat behind the walls of Capua with most of his battered army, Sulla judged him not to be an immediate threat and turned north. It was Scipio's turn. Thundering up the Via Latina toward Tinum, Sulla's army met the second consular army near its base, but didn't immediately go on the attack, optimistic about the prospects of diplomacy with a more moderate leader. The proconsul put out feelers and managed to arrange talks with Scipio. Although the back-and-forth term talking was initially cordial enough, Scipio felt it only right and proper to inform his defeated co-consul what he was doing, and to seek his counsel. So he dispatched the most prominent Marian in the army, except for himself, to act as go-between. Unfortunately for Scipio, that man was another Roman legend, Quintus Sertorius, future guerrilla king of Hispania. Despising Sulla, Sertorius went on the consul's mission, but intentionally provoked a fight by capturing Zuessa on the way, a town which had sided with the Optimates. Stunned, Scipio returned Sulla's hostages, and the armies prepared for battle. It was at this moment the proconsul sprang a trap which would become one of his most famous. Aware that the Scipione legions were far from secure in loyalty anyway, and furthermore blamed the consuls for breaking the armistice, Sulla had his own veteran soldiers strategically fraternize with the enemy army during the anti-eroderation of his parley with Scipio. What exactly the proconsul's troops said or did isn't known, but we can imagine them bringing extra rations to the Marian camp along with a portion of their eastern treasure, sharing both and, by doing so, championing their general's cause. This kind of interaction must have taken place around 1,000 campfires and in 100 grand tents. Rank-and-file soldiers were gradually convinced by argument, flattery, and thinly veiled bribery. In the upper echelons, sullen officers shared drinks with their adversarial counterparts and were turned by promises of position and power. By the time Sulla drew up his army and advanced in Scipio's tent, the latter's authority rested on a foundation of sand. The consul had no idea. In a prearranged signal, 20 cohorts of Sulla's veterans saluted Scipio's encamped warriors in a greeting which was returned by a greeting of their own. Then, to the consul's utter disbelief, his entire army streamed out of the camp and flocked to join Sulla as if their minds had been enchanted. Thoroughly outmaneuvered, Scipio simply sat bemused in his tent until the Sullans came to get him. The consul was captured and dismissed by his enemy, unharmed. Still, a large part of Italy still supported the Marian cause against the invaders, and so Sulla was forced to keep his tact front and center. With Scipio appropriately dealt with, Sulla turned about and once again sent entreaties to Norbanus, probably aiming to repeat his sorcerer's trick. They failed once again, and the proconsul continued his unstoppable advance on Capua. Unwilling to stand against Sulla there, the surviving consul abandoned the city and made his way to the Marian stronghold at Praeneste. A lull in the fighting followed, during which both factions took a breath, drew back and prepared for the second round. Up until this point, Sulla had made an attempt at negotiating every time he had the chance. Rejected, it was this moment which saw the war descend into a bloodbath, justified by said rejections. For by the end of the year 83 BC, Sulla and his legions had won many Italian cities to their cause as they continued their march to However, his Marian enemies were still strong, and a tense military standoff ensued, with both sides attempting to raise additional forces for the coming campaigns. A bitter winter also froze the respective armies in place, locking any movement down until the thaw of 82. When the year turned, elections took place in Rome and new consuls were elected, somewhat predictably given the circumstances. Carbo and Marius the Younger were appointed to the position, just as Caesar's hallowed name would serve as a potent weapon for Octavian decades later. Elevating Gaius Marius' son to the consulship engendered a renewed burst of support from the Marian heartlands in Etruria and Umbria. There, the old general's name was still encased in gold, and his veterans consequently turned out in great numbers to support their revered commander's heir. It is important to point out that the main armies marching around Italy, despite their immense size, were not the be-all and end-all of the war. Regions and their cities may have predominantly leaned one way or the other, but all throughout the Roman heartland, bitter factional strife raged between pro- and anti-Sulla factions. A sullen proponent in the Umbrian city of Ameria, for example, briefly managed to incite the people into supporting the invading general, but was cut down by unknown Marian assassins not long after. When the campaigning season of 8 to began, Sulla sent Metellus and Pompey with an army north to confront Carbo at Ariminum and make a play for Cisalpine Gaul. DD number 7 at the river Asus, the Populares and Optimates met once more for battle, with 5 cohorts defecting over to the Optimates. The fight was fierce but rapid, as the main line of the Optimates were able to push the Populares back, allowing Pompey to then finish them off with a cavalry assault. At the same time, the proconsul continued his personal advance on Rome and encountered a larger army under Marius the Younger at Sacroporto. Sulla had been attempting to reach Dolabella, whom he hoped would defect to his side, but Marius the Younger had hemmed his forces in by blockading the roads into Latium with a force of 40,000 men. Sulla, however, was eager to break through the events, having experienced a vision of Marius the Elder warning his son that he would suffer a great military disaster on that day. However, His soldiers were exhausted, and arraigned earlier in the day had waterlogged their equipment and the battlefield, prompting his tribunes to advise him to pitch camp instead and rest for the night. Sulla relented, and while his soldiers began digging defensive earthworks, Marius the Younger assaulted his position. However, when Sulla's men fought back, 5 cohorts and 2 cavalry elae defected to Sulla, prompting a collapse of Marius forces and causing a rout. It is said that between 15,000 and 25,000 soldiers of the populares were killed in a slaughter, breaking Marius' forces completely. The defeated Marian commander Onda's shattered army ran for shelter to Praeneste, but Sulla pursued them so closely and fiercely that the Praenestians were forced to shut the gates before Marius himself could enter. In a hair-raising moment, the beleaguered general was hauled over the wall by a rope, while his men were captured or massacred against the fortifications. In a grim foretaste of what was to come, Sulla had all the Samnites among them executed as rebels, devoured by paranoia and fury at being humbled in such an embarrassing way. Marius the Younger sent grim orders to Rome that anyone suspected of loyalty to Sulla was to be killed. To that end, 4 prominent figures who had previously sought reconciliation with Sulla, including the Pontifex Maximus Mucius Scaevola, were slain as they tried to escape, further intensifying the bloody ideological nature of the war. At number Y, leaving a small force to keep Marius at bay in Praeneste, Sulla split his main army into 2 distinct divisions and pushed north on Carbo. Sulla's group, traversing the Via Cassia toward Clusium, defeated an enemy cavalry force on the river Clanis. The second group, moving along the Via Clodia, continued on without incident and defeated enemy forces near Saturnia. The details of the battle the river Clanis and Saturnia are fascinating, as they tell us about Carbo's strategy, stringing out small forces along the route to bog Sulla down with skirmishes as a delaying tactic. Meanwhile, Carbo himself was amassing an impressive force for battle, large enough that he could split off 8 legions to march south down the Via Flaminia to break the siege of Praeneste under his legate. C. Marcius Censorinus, the proconsul, himself then came to blows with the consulsman army near Clusium itself, but the grueling day-long battle had no clear winner. Elsewhere, the war was also going well for the Sullan cause. Metellus was able to craftily sail around the Marian strongpoint at Arimanum to advance on Cisalpine, Gaul by Ravenna, and Optimate, forswear sweeping their way across Sardinia. Pompey was marching against Carbo's blockading force under C. Carrinas at Sens Gallicus, and engaged them in battle, losing 3,000 of his men. Carrinas was forced to retreat to the city of Spoletium and requested reinforcements. Carbo's relief force, however, was quickly located and ambushed by Sulla, who slew 2,000 of them and routed the remainder. Having lost control of both the Via Cassia and Via Flaminia, Carbo was forced to make a bolder move, sending Censorinus and his legions on a rapid march to outflank Sulla and relieve Praeneste. Again, Sulla was able to locate the relief force and intercept it, ambushing them at a pass, and then surrounding them on a nearby hilltop. Censorinus was quickly blamed by his men for leading them into disaster, and most of the army deserted, leaving him with a mere 7 cohorts in the end. Having lost massive part of his forces, Carbo and Norbanus retreated north to deal with Metellus. At the Battle of Favencia, Carbo attempted a rapid march to attempt to reach and defeat before nightfall, arriving an hour before sundown. In their attempt to surprise Metellus, they had made their plans. Hostilians stumbled into thick vineyards, allowing Metellus to respond with greater care. Between 9 and 10,000 of Carbo's forces were slain, with another 6,000 deserting, and only 1,000 making it back to Araminium intact. Upon hearing of this news, a legion of Lucanians defected to Metellus, further bolstering his forces, while their commander, Albanovinus, had managed to arrange a nasty assassination of all of Carbo and Norbanus' commanders in a feast. leaving the populares leaderless and completely on the back foot. Norbanus chose this moment to flee Italy and commit suicide, while Carbo desperately attempted once again to break the siege of Praeneste, only for his forces to be defeated once more at the Battle of Fidentia by Marcus Lucullus, brother of the more famous general of that name. At Fidentia, Lucullus had found himself Severi Lutnumbarred, with 18 cohorts facing nearly 50 loyal to Carbo and the populares under Quinctius. Worse still, his men were short on arms and ammunition. However, a breeze blew flowers down from the mountains, which attached themselves to the men, forming the appearance of wreaths and garlands on the helmets and shields of his men. Taking this as an omen, and with morale soaring, Lucullus and his men attacked, breaking Quinctius' army and slaying 10 to 18,000 of them. Retreating back to Clusium, Carbo and his remaining army of 30,000 men once more engaged Pompey, near the city. But allegedly 2/3 of his army was slaughtered in the battle. However, due to one of Sulla's previous sanctions, the proconsul himself was to be denied a decisive victory directly against Carbo, possibly triggered by the proconsul's wanton slaughter of Samnite prisoners after thrashing Marius before Praeneste. A fresh, allied force of up to 70,000 Samnites and Lucanians burst from Samnium and went straight for the small force Sulla had ordered to keep the young Marius in check. Disengaging from his campaign in Etruria, Sulla doubled back with blistering alacrity and managed to install his own army in a pass between the interlopers and Praeneste. The Italians attempted to break in while Marius tried to break out. Both failed. But now the coalition army, which was under the command of a Samnite known as Pontius Telesinus, alongside M. Lamponius and Guta, all survivors of the last social war, was in big trouble. It had Sulla in front, apparently unbreakable within his natural fortress, while dashing Pompey was swiftly following up behind, ready to crush the recalcitrant Italians from both sides. What Telesinus needed was a distraction to pull Sulla out from his position, and the Samnite leader had a very shiny one very close by. Abruptly breaking camp during the dark hours of October 31st of 82 BC, Telesinus' great army closed in on Rome itself, a city which was almost utterly undefended due to the ongoing conflict. After joining with some remnant Marian forces, this terrifying force arrived and encamped 1 mile outside the Eternal City's Colline Gate. A historian, senator and soldier of the era known as Velleius Paterculus states that this was the situation Rome had faced since Hannibal had camped just miles from the city after Cannae. He puts a speech in Telesinus' mouth in which he proclaims, "The last day is at hand for the Romans. These wolves that made such ravages on Italian liberty will never vanish until we've cut down the forest that harbors them." For the first time ever, a coalition of Rome's Italian neighbors were in a position to take the city, but Sulla, suddenly understanding the threat, was hurrying in order to stop them, unwilling to chance assaulting the massive capital. A dangerous enemy army was on his heels. No matter how tempting it was, Telesinus restrained his forces and prepared to meet Sulla for the great final battle. It was so final because Carbo, defeated in the north by the other Optimate generals, had withdrawn to Sicily. This was it. A small force of young citizens sallied out of the city against Telesinus, but were repelled, sending forward a squadron of several hundred cavalry to harry the attackers and make their inward movement sluggish. Sulla, rushing down the Via Praeneste, managed to get beyond the Samnite-led coalition army and encamped next to the Temple of Venus, just outside the Colline Gate at noon. If the enemy wanted to breach Rome, they would have to get past his veterans. Several of the proconsul's officers, noting the tiredness of the men and the lateness of the hour, advised their general not to attack. However, eager for battle and confident of victory, Sulla brought his standards to bear, arrayed his troops and attacked regardless, initiating the battle in late afternoon. The right flank, led by Crassus, won victory with the ease to which the Sullans had become accustomed, driving their opposition all the way to Antemnae, with massive losses. However, beset by fierce Samnite warriors and exhausted from the march, Sulla's own left flank collapsed under the pressure and his men routed towards the gate. Despite their commander's swashbuckling efforts at rallying them, however, Roman veterans manning the walls dropped the portcullis in forethought the enemy might follow in after, blocking the line of retreat. Faced with resistance or death, Sulla's troops turned, fought, and, in the early evening, managed to turn the tide. As the great battle began winding down near the Colline Gate, messengers came to Sulla from Crassus, who had been separated from his leader at the start of the battle, informed of the deaths of Telsius and Albinus, and the resulting triumph. The proconsul realized, with some confusion, Thath had won the battle, and with it, the war. The brutality and deadliness of this battle was so great that 50,000 men apparently died. Within earshot of Rome that day, 8,000 Samnite prisoners were also summarily executed. After his decisive triumph was confirmed, Sulla went to attend Crassus at Antemnae, where a 3,000-strong segment of the besieged garrison, swollen by refugees from the clash at the Colline Gate, proceeded to beg the victorious proconsul for mercy. In his typically vulpine manner, Sulla stated that he would grant them mercy, but only if they would do some mischief to his other enemies inside beforehand. They did so, desperately slaughtering thousands of their own allies and allowing the proconsul inside. It was a terrible mistake. They didn't realize the time for mercy or humanity was over. Disarmed and at the mercy of their conqueror, the remaining Samnite and Lucanian prisoners, about 6,000 in number, were marched into Rome and herded into the Villa Publica. As this was happening, Sulla summoned the Senate to the nearby temple of Bologna and began orating to the august body of his deeds in the Mithridatic War and in the catastrophic civil war he had just won. The moment Sulla did begin to speak, however, a strange noise became audible. It might not have been overly distinguishable at first amid the hustle and bustle of the capital, but as the sounds multiplied, it was clear to every senator what the noise was. Terrified, agonized, shrieking, noticing the senatorial disquiet, Sulla simply said in calm and composed lung that the senators ought to keep their attention firmly on him and not worry about what was going on outside. It was, he said, only a matter of criminals being punished on his orders. If the cause of the noise wasn't clear enough, Sulla had penned the 6,000 prisoners from Antemnae into a public building and just massacred them in earshot of the Senate as a warning. After this he went and addressed the people also. His message was stark: the guiltless needn't fear. But anybody who had been his enemy since Scipio's broken truce was essentially finished, barely straining his muscles. Sulla marched on Praeneste and induced Marius the Younger to commit suicide before executing a great number of his troops. One account, probably more accurate, details how Sulla, now de facto dictator of Rome, split the townspeople into 3 groups: Roman, Samnite, and Praenestine. The latter categories were executed to the last man, while the Romans were treated to a verbal thrashing. They deserved to die horribly for the crimes they had committed, Sulla said, but nevertheless spared them. Throughout the Italian peninsula, Sulla supporters engaged in an overly vigorous mass slaying of their defeated enemies, leading one senator to plead with Sulla. Would he please confirm who he wanted saved and who he wanted dead? He did just that. The next morning, the dictator posted a list of 80 public enemies who could be killed with impunity, including Carbo, Norbanus, Scipio, and Sertorius. The morning after that, 220 additional names appeared. On the 3rd day, about the same amount more. These were the famous proscription lists. Many Marian renegades were hunted down and their heads brought to Sulla. But innocents also suffered under the predation of the dictator's head. A certain Quintus Aurelius, a quiet but rich man whose role in the political struggle consisted of simply counseling with others, entered the forum one day to find his own Namian. The list. Understanding the reason immediately, Aurelius exclaimed, Woe is me, my Alban farm has informed against me. It is important to realize that these avarice-driven excesses were not Sulla's intention. Although his brutal policy did enable them, however brutal his actual motivations may have been towards political enemies, they at least seem to have been driven by a greater good. When he discovered that Crassus had executed a man in Bruttium purely to acquire the man's estate, Sulla cast the future triumvir out and forbade him from embarking on public business again in a legislative capacity. Sulla redoubled his attack on the troublesome position of tribune, which he believed to be the toxic component in the Roman system. To remedy the situation, he both deprived the tribunes of any power to introduce new laws to the people, and also prevented any man who had occupied the tribunician rank from seeking any other magistracy. By doing this, he discouraged the perennially ambitious Roman political class from seeking the position in the first place. Along with his political massacring of the people's representative, Sulla also set about attempting to prevent any future attempt to do what he had so recently done. As proconsul, lead a loyal army from the provinces into Italy and seized the republic for himself. To do this, Hemida Maestas, or treason laws, more strict, treasonous actions on the part of governors were no, exactly defined. It was treasonous should a governor refuse to return from his provinces in 30 days of his successors' arrival, led an army out of their province or ward without Senate's permission. On the home front, Sulla initiated the Lex Cornelia Annolis, solidifying the traditional structure of the cursus honorum. A politician was required Tob 36 to be elected aedile, 39 for the praetorship, and 42 to serve as a consul. Another old law was brought back into full force, which stated that when a man had held a specific office, he could not hold that office again until a decade had passed. These were just some of the many measures Sulla took as the wayward republic's guiding steward, its most notorious dictator. He acutely tweaked, duly modified, and dutifully restored institutions swerve. He took issue, but it would be wrong to call these changes reforms. They were designed not to bring on a new age, as many reforms are, but to bring back a brilliant system which, Sulla believed, had degenerated and been taken down the wrong path. Once the dictator believed all that could be done was done in his service of maintaining Rome in its traditional form, he did as most Roman dictators did. In contrast to the eponymous power-mad tyrants of our modern age, Sulla relinquished his great power voluntarily and became a private citizen once more. Then, in an act which Cincinnatus would have been proud of, he took himself from the capital and retired to a luxurious villa near Putelli. There, Sulla Felix indulged in the noble pursuit of hunting and spent a great deal of time fishing. In solitude, indoors, he hosted many of the old theater comrades with whom he had associated in the days before his prominence, lounging on couches, talking, swapping jokes, and drinking fine wines day after day, as he lived out the final years of his life in this most degenerate of ways. The former ruler of Rome also penned his memoirs, of which unfortunately only fragments survive today. Gradually, given his repeated, intense bouts of drinking and cohorting, Sulla's health began to decline. Although technically he was still able to exercise power. In a final burst of energy, he ended a period of discord between new colonists of Putelli and some of the older inhabitants. A small time later, Sulla discovered that a magistrate known as Granius was withholding money destined for theft. After having this corrupt man brought into his presence, Sulla shouted that he bestrangled, but suffered a hemorrhage in his anger and died the following morning. In 78 BC, however pivotal this man was for the history of the Roman Republic and its future, it is perhaps one of the things he didn't do that was truly to have the longest lasting impact. During the dictatorship of Sulla, a number of noble supporters intercede on behalf of a young man whom the ruler wanted dead, refusing his wishes. Eventually relenting, Sulla is said to have remarked, "Very well then, you win. Take him, But never forget that the man whom you want me to spare will one day prove heroine of the party which you and I have so long defended. There are many Mariuses in this fellow. The fellow of whom Sulla spoke, whose life he so reluctantly spared, was one Gaius. Julius Caesar. We have more videos on Roman history available exclusively for the members and patrons. Join them via the links in the description and pinned comment to watch more than 200 exclusive videos. We will have more videos on the Romans and many other historical events available for free, too, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our videos would not be possible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.